Okay, hello and ready for part 3. We're now on slide 4 with time and memory. It's dense. This material is really dense and there's a lot to say about it. I feel like somehow we're really in the heart of the course right now with these topics. Okay, but we've been over a little bit of the information on slide 5 and 6 already as I've been talking, so we should be able to get this done in 15 or 20 minutes. So what about the time periods involved in the process of memory encoding and storage and retrieval? And that's kind of how I'm distinguishing that this other element of memory is what the people hear a lot of the distinction of short-term versus long-term memory. And then there's this concept of working memory and how does that play in? So I guess the main things that come up about this are that we do know that we have a limited amount of short-term memory that holds things more accurately, but more briefly, before they really get filed and are able to be accessed according to our kind of internal filing system. So in short-term memory, it's literally like this holding pattern, and we seem to be able to remember things depending on the nature of the content for as briefly as only about 10 minutes and that would probably be in the form of semantic memory. If we take in new information that is just factual knowledge, semantic memory, it probably is only going to last about 10 minutes for us unless we can place it into long-term memory. So that's important to know. Conversely, when we're talking about episodic memory that has more to do with our autobiographical story, and most likely this is because of the encoding we talked about before, one of the big hints about how to encode things better and take them from short-term memory deeper into long-term memory storage is when you make it personal, when you tie it to something you already know or to part of your own story. So for episodic memories that are going to become part of our own stories of our lives, they probably can stay in short-term memory more like 24 hours, maybe up to 48 hours. And I can give you the example of today, you and I can remember fairly well what happened yesterday throughout our day. We can remember, excuse me, I need to stretch for a minute. All this lecturing, maybe you should do the same, I don't know. The shoulders get sore when you sit at the computer, huh? Okay, so we can remember what we did yesterday. Like I had a memory just now of being in yoga class and how it felt good to be stretching my neck and doing some other things for my body. And I can probably remember the chronology of my day more or less, not every second of the 24 hours, but as you think back, you can remember what happened yesterday, more or less. And that's still in short-term memory, but what will happen is, unless something was really important or pertinent about yesterday, it happened to be your birthday, so there was some emotional content and some special or unusual things happened yesterday that don't happen on a daily basis, that stuff that's clear to you today is not going to make it into long-term storage. And if I ask you in 2 days or even a week from now, you will not really be able to distinguish what happened this Monday versus any other Monday. And interference is probably coming into that too. If you have the similar routines and patterns that you do 5 days a week, then the memories have a harder time getting stored with particular cues that are episodic. So short-term memory varies a bit. Semantic level information probably only lasts about 10 or 15 minutes. Episodic type of information probably lasts about 24 to 48 hours. And both of them will go away if we don't get parts of it into long-term storage. And so we know, because we've talked already about the hippocampus's role in moving things from short-term to long-term storage, and that those other memories and that top-down processing of deciding what's important or what isn't or what's meaningful or what will be useful is happening all at the same time, and those pathways are being strengthened. How long does that take? Well, what was really interesting, I think, about this chapter that you might not have come across before were these consolidation theories about how long do memories take to really firmly get into long-term storage to where we could kind of say that they'll never be eroded, short of severe damage to the brain, that they'll be there permanently. And various theorists have said it's maybe 10 years of slow consolidation before that we could argue that those memories are truly permanent. And that's interesting. And do those memories deteriorate if they've made it kind of into that 10-year span? Seems like they don't. Seems like they're pretty indelible. Again, now that doesn't mean that we might not have an error in retrieval, but that's different than having them erode in the storage, if that makes sense. So things like Alzheimer's or something could come into play and be able to retrieve some of those long-term memories. But we even find with people who have Alzheimer's that the oldest memories are often the most indelible, the ones that had been consolidated the longest ago and seem to get to that permanent stage. That people can relive and rehearse and talk to you over and over about those old memories that they have. All right, so what are the theories about this? Well, two had kind of, again, come up somewhat simultaneously from Squire, who you know is a major memory theorist, and you should know a few of these names. You should definitely know Squire, Tolving, who both worked together at different times, and Schachter. Another big name is McGough, who's going to come up a little later because he's worked a great deal on emotional memory. I think that's how you pronounce his name, James McGough. And then Moscovich and Nadel. Lynn Nadel, are other ones to know, big memory researchers. And I can say I'm excited to report that I have met with Lynn Nadel. He is actually at the University of Arizona, been there a long time, and he's done a great deal of research on memory in a lot of ways, but particularly had a fairly seminal paper that one or two of you cited, I think, related to traumatic amnesia, psychogenically caused traumatic amnesia. And so I met with him about that and a project that I'm working on and whether we could co-author or not. So anyway, kind of cool guy, interesting, and open to new researchers, which was nice to know. Okay, so let's back up. So standard consolidation theory was developed by Squire and McGough, kind of separately, but both settled on that term for the theory. Meaning, basically, how is that different from the other theory? Well, they would argue that the hippocampus is so central at first, like we've been talking about, and I guess I kind of skipped over this piece, but the idea of working memory, I would say you should think of working memory like the intersection between long-term and short-term. It's where it's all happening, and it's all happening in the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is the home of working memory. It's that process of oscillation occurring between old memory stores and new memory stores and what's going to be kept and not. And it's in this process kind of under construction, the working area of memory, and it's not done yet. And so they would say that that process is long and slow, and that depending on future experiences you have and new information that comes in, does it add to what you just got a few days ago? Does it strengthen particular pathways? Is it more along those lines? And so then slowly but surely the memory that you were starting to form 3 or 4 days ago or weeks ago is getting consolidated because of all the new things coming in as well, or it's getting pruned. So they're saying this consolidation is ongoing and the hippocampus is very primary in it at first, but they would argue then that as the storage is finalized in the outer areas of the brain, in the cortex, then the hippocampus is less and less involved and less necessary because of it's such the role of that connector. So they're saying that once long-term memories are filed, then they're there and they have enough other memories connected to them in those outer file areas that our thinking and retrieval can get to those memories without going through the hippocampus, is what they argue. We don't really know for sure about this. We need a lot more neural scans. We're still learning. But that was the argument that they believed, and this was in part because when people would have damage to the hippocampus, they still could retrieve a number of those memories. So they would argue that once it's consolidated, then in a way you don't really need the hippocampus anymore to get memories out. The multiple memory trace theory is a little different than that. It also argues that memories are created slowly over time, but that they argue that the hippocampus is always pretty necessary and that it never really stops being involved in the retrieval process. So Moscovich and Nadel suggest that even in cases where the hippocampus has been damaged, you do still see some issues in retrieval, or that retrieval. They cite some studies and some of their own work that, let me think how to phrase this for a moment. That let's say one node or topic of memory, like your memory for beach time, for ocean experiences and beaches, does not settle in just one region of the brain. Yes, it's true that if we opened you up, we might be able to stimulate a very small, tiny surface area of your cortex, and you would start seeing visions of the beach, and you might start smelling the salty air and the kind of musty, seaweedy, sandy smell, and imagining the cry of seagulls, that could stimulate you to almost remember and feel a part of the aspect of beaches. But they would argue that that's not the whole memory of beaches for you. You have all kinds of other things, like the time you saw lighthouses and what that was about, and maybe who was with you, and the feelings you had, or if there was a fear of heights, and so that memory is distributed in so many places, the multiple memory traces, that in order to really have a collective sense of what beaches mean to you, you still need the hippocampus because it's the one that can tie those all together. And so that's kind of what they argue, is that even people who have damage to parts of the hippocampus, they can't retrieve memory as well or as in detailed fashion without its use. And so they would argue that the whole process of encoding and storage and retrieval best works when the hippocampus is always involved, all the way along and even after 10 and more years. Okay, well, the problem with both of these theories are that they can't explain some other research findings that have come along. So the newer theory of long-term storage and this idea of short-term versus long-term storage that we are mostly subscribing to now, we're calling reconsolidation theory. And this one was put forth by Nader primarily, and then some research by Forcato has supported that. And so what they're arguing is kind of a combination of the other two earlier theories. Not surprising, theorists do this often. They would say that older memories are more dominated by the standard consolidation theory, and so 10 and more years in, that there does seem to be less of a reliance on the hippocampus. But newer memories that you've been working with just for the last decade or so, or even the last year or two, are more explainable by multiple trace theory, that the hippocampus is demonstrating this ongoing back and forth movement between old and new memories and kind of in the process of consolidation, so that it's much more active with newer memories than with older memories. So that the argument, I guess, to make it a little clearer, is that we are constantly reconsolidating memory, but we're reconsolidating as in checking and deciding if it's still useful and adding details to it back and forth. More recent memories, we're doing that process of reconsolidation more often and more likely than we are with really old memories. We basically stop adding new information to old memories at a certain point, it seems. Therefore, the hippocampus is less necessary. We kind of call it done, and those memories don't change much. They retain that character and they just stay as they are once we get past a certain point of consolidation with them. Okay. This is sort of an aside. I guess it has to do with time, and that's why I put it here, but I hadn't mentioned earlier that one of the really interesting differences between semantic and episodic memory is this idea of where is that time and date stamp happening? Because with semantic memory, that's not happening. With autobiographical episodic memory, that is happening. And they've isolated to one very small area right near the hippocampus, known as the entorhinal or perientorhinal cortex. Rhino, if you think of it like nose, and so it is kind of just behind your nose and right under and near the hippocampus, which is in the center there. And that if that small area is damaged, people are unable to date and timestamp their memories of themselves. So we're learning more about that, but it's really fascinating that there's some small area that can pick up enough cues from the environment to know where and when something's happening, and then include that with the memory trace that's being made. Okay, so what happens when we have trauma? I already mentioned before that you can have physiological types of trauma or you can have psychological types of trauma, and both can affect memory. But they can affect different memory systems. So how do they affect episodic and semantic memory, though? Explicit memory. Well, to remind you of a couple terms to know about amnesia or total memory loss, it tends to be either one of two types, anterograde or retrograde. Anterograde amnesia, of course, meaning that from the moment the damage occurs, no new memories get formed, or no new explicit memories get formed. And then retrograde amnesia, meaning that from the time of the damage, old memories, looking back, retrospectively, are damaged. I just paused for a minute there because I was thinking about sometimes we have to tease out with amnesia if there's a failure to retrieve the old memories, if that's where the problem is. So the memories aren't actually damaged, but the retrieval process is damaged. or if there's actually damage to the cortical areas that contained the storage of the memory. So both could happen with retrograde amnesia, one or the other. With anterograde, it would be preventing new memories, so preventing encoding from happening. So you should know that. We also know there's a phenomena that's kind of a temporary type of amnesia known as transient global amnesia, and this is usually due to basically kind of a temporary state of damage to the brain that can be fairly quickly resolved or healed. So that could be like serious concussion, and so people's memory systems are basically kind of jogged, frozen. So we know that all of this is happening on a chemical or electrical basis. So if a great deal of electricity is experienced by the brain, or a chemical disruption because of a serious trauma and the brain shuts down, like moves into a coma for a period of time, then memory is not happening. But if the brain regains its full function again, then memory will start up again. And oxygen loss will cause this as well, as long as it wasn't too long and too extensive. So that's one thing that can happen. So then the person just loses a shorter period of time, but their memories before that period of time and the memories after are okay. And then finally, as we talked about, so what about psychological trauma? If we experience something, it has to be of a certain magnitude, is what we've determined, like threat of death or very serious injury or like penetration of self, or witnessing that in someone we love. And so that is enough for some people to cause amnesia, and it can be permanent. I wrote about this quite a bit in your comments, so you can read a little more about it. And we are going to get to this more also in the emotional chapter. But what I do want to say is that this type of trauma, psychological trauma, seems to only affect explicit memory system, not implicit memory systems. And that is interesting. So you can lose semantic memory, and you can lose, more likely, episodic memory when you experience a psychological trauma like this. But you won't. I don't think there are maybe any cases where you would lose like skill memory or the emotional memories of the experience, or like sense, olfactory, or tactile memories of the experience. So generally, this kind of amnesia is linked to, it can be a couple of things, but it's mostly an issue of encoding. So the trauma changes your chemical makeup temporarily to deal with the psychological trauma, and that prevents encoding for a period of time. It's almost like it puts the brain into shock for a period of time, and so memory is messed with. But what's really interesting about it, and that I had started to write about, and this is some of my own research that I'm sharing now. I can post a paper if you're interested to look at it. It's a little technical and complex, but I'm happy to share that if you want, or a couple of diagrams. But what we believe is happening, or what I've identified, is it all boils down basically to cortisol. And cortisol being the stress hormone that we think of, and norepinephrine is involved in epinephrine at the very early stage because they help trigger whether cortisol is produced and in what amounts. But we believe that it has something to do with how people very quickly assess or perceive the trauma. They either perceive the trauma that's about to happen or is happening as somewhat controllable or totally uncontrollable. If they perceive it as slightly controllable, as in there might be something they can do immediately to either get out of it or make it less bad, then their body goes into a fight or flight response, that stress response, which triggers chemicals at certain levels. Or if they perceive instead there's like a feeling of total shock and there's absolutely nothing I can do, oh my God, is more the response, then people will go into a freeze response. And that does something different chemically to the body. And so fight or flight, down the cascade a little ways, creates extremely high levels of cortisol. It mobilizes everything in us to do something, almost superhuman strength, or more than we ever would normally. And so that, interestingly, so super high levels of cortisol, and it has to be like 700-800 milligrams of cortisol, well above normal limits, because on an everyday basis, we need cortisol just to be alert and functioning and moving and doing things. And so we kind of ride in a middle range between maybe 100 to 300 milligrams in our blood at any given time. But when it shoots kind of off the charts, well beyond 600 milligrams and sometimes higher for people, then what happens is it binds with the same receptor as our memory chemical does. If you remember, acetylcholine is the chemical that facilitates encoding of memory, and tons of it is circulating around the hippocampus, and cortisol and acetylcholine are both binding with those receptors at any given time in normal circumstances. And so not too much acetylcholine is binding and just a little bit of cortisol is binding. And so memory is being facilitated by acetylcholine in this moderate way. But when it shoots off the charts in a fight or flight response, then there's so much cortisol that it's basically blocking all the receptors from receiving any acetylcholine. And so no new memory is formed. And this, for me, is the main argument with traumatic amnesia that we see happening in about 30% of cases of people who experience this type of death-defying trauma. They have a traumatic amnesia experience because they went into fight or flight response. And so it really depends on the person a little and exactly what their levels of cortisol are. We are actually able to measure this in hospitals. There's a couple teams, one in Germany, Gustav Schelling and his associates have been measuring people's cortisol levels within like 6 to 10 hours after a car accident or right after a serious surgery, and figuring out how that affects their memory in those hours and days after, and then following up with them months and sometimes a year or more later, and finding out where amnesia has occurred. Also, Delahanty was someone in the US and his team who looked at car accident victims and their reports of amnesia of the accident or not, and cortisol levels. So anyway, fight or flight blocks acetylcholine, prevents encoding. No memory ever happens for the trauma, or only a tiny snippet of memory might slip through. A little acetylcholine makes it through, but almost no memory of the trauma. There can be a complete amnesia. Once that calms back down, then normal memory can be facilitated again. But there may never be a memory for the trauma, right, if it doesn't encode at all. Okay, on the other hand, when people go into a freeze response, and we don't have much choice over this, it just happens rather automatically to us, believing there's maybe nothing we can do about the trauma in the moment, then the body kind of shuts down more, cortisol levels go way low. So, there are people reporting like 7 to 25 milligrams of cortisol circulating, which is really low. It's probably about, 500% lower than it would normally be. And both of these strategies of the brain seem protective. The one protects you from the awful memory of it, but prepares you to maybe do something about it. The other possibly protects you by saving you from freezing, kind of like animals play dead, and they go through this process as well, and shutting things down and conserving resources. But the unfortunate outcome of that is that when you have really low cortisol, then tons of acetylcholine is circulating, and very strong memories are facilitated of the trauma, i.e. PTSD. So people can then have intrusive, like flashbulb memories of the trauma over and over because the memory was encoded so intensely and deeply, unlike most of our memories. So that is unfortunately the fallout. We hope that people can go through a trauma and not really go into full fight or flight or freeze and kind of be able to process it and move through it, and then their memories will be about average of that experience. And actually, there's, I think, only one known study that I found so far that has attempted to administer cortisol if they can get people within that 6 to 12 hour window after a trauma and manage their cortisol levels. If they can keep them between about 200 and 600 milligrams of cortisol, they can literally prevent either PTSD or traumatic amnesia. It also helps afterward, of course, to talk about it with people, process it. Those things will help to normalize and kind of get you back to integrating the trauma into your life. But anyway, an area that I'm really interested in and have done quite a bit of study on. And so we can see that memory is very variable depending on what's going on chemically inside of us as well as electrically. All right, last slide. I basically have been all over that already, I guess. I'm trying to see, did I miss anything? I guess just to mention, like, there are some unusual side correlated disorders that we talk about in psychology, like dissociative amnesia, where, again, like probably cortisol levels were pretty high and maybe sustained, that maybe someone's been through lots of high-level stress and over and over different kinds of psychological traumas, and so they kind of move into more of a dissociative state, and they're easily triggered to go there, and that messes with memory a bit. But they generally have like bits and pieces. They can not encode as well as other people, but they can encode some semantic memory and some episodic memory, depending on probably where their cortisol levels are at any given time. We also see people that move into a psychogenic fugue, which is like a temporary, can last months potentially, but suspension of anterograde memory being formed. And no, that's not right. Sorry, psychogenic fugue is retrograde amnesia. So retrograde memories are blocked, probably from being retrieved. Usually those people can get back in touch with who they were and what they knew before once they get stabilized. But this is a really weird one. It's quite rare, but where people might suddenly just take off, not know where they are, just get on a train, go somewhere, and end up having to start a new life in a new town because they have no idea who they are or were. So very, very rare, but another aspect that can happen when these different chemicals get messed with, and often triggered by that HPA axis response to trauma. Okay, I think that's plenty, and I will sign off there. Talk to you guys later.